of voters against President Trump, but new polling shows they'll have to pray a lot harder. Coming up.
As Democrats bang the collusion drum over Donald Trump Jr.'s meeting with the Russian lawyer, it may not be having the impact on voters that they expected. According to a new Washington Post ABC News poll, roughly 4 in 10 Americans think the Trump campaign worked with the Russians to try and influence the campaign. However, a last poll that was taken back in April, long before the Trump Jr. Russia revelations. Today, President Trump sounded off again about the controversy, tweeting, quote, "Most politicians would have gone to a meeting like the one Don Jr. attended in order to get info on an opponent. That's politics." All right, well, I don't know about that last part, especially because the same poll that we just talked about also said that people responded by a 2-to-1 margin that they did think the meeting was inappropriate.
Inappropriate, yes, but not illegal. And again, so you keep hearing more and more constitutional scholars over the weekend saying, look, maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't have done it. That's not the issue, but whether or not it was legal, they cannot find one single person, I haven't, who said it was illegal. And again, I think they're hanging, the people who think something bad happened are hanging their hat on exchanging something of value. And they're saying that this information, this opposition research is something of value. But I think the technicality of the law says that, no, it has to be a physical thing, a monetary value, not just information. Information is valuable no matter what, and there's no way to monetize that.
Right. Dagan, were you surprised to see that it didn't change anyone's mind? I wasn't really surprised to see that it didn't change anyone's mind. People seem pretty strong and steadfast in whatever their opinions of this is by this point.
I think that people have stopped listening to the rhetoric about it. It is part of what's happening. And I do think that if the Democrats keep hammering this and thinking somehow they're going to win the midterm elections based on chatter about the Trump administration and the campaign and Russia, that they're delusional if they think that that's going to work, because people increasingly are becoming deaf to it. They care about their livelihoods. They care about their families, not Russia.
And they set the expectation. Yeah, they set the expectation so much that, aha, this is a smoking gun. They've got him. And then they go to the statute and like, well, wait a minute. No, they didn't get something of value. It's a conversation. So how is that being influenced necessarily? And having been through 13 different campaigns personally, you know, it's kind of hard when someone says to you, I've got opposition.
I believe that this poll didn't change much because the gullible are still the gullible.
Yeah.
It's not recruiting in new people to believe this stuff. I start to use another word I can use on the radio, but I'm going to respect the fact that I'm on this TV show. And here's what's happening with all of this.
You can
nothing
use that word
burger.
On radio?
Yeah.
In Georgia?
Yeah. That is true. I can use it in Georgia. Here's the principle here about this nothing burger. The Democrats have demonstrated over and over and over, if they throw enough mud on the wall often enough, long enough to see what sticks, they're hoping that they're going to attract some other people. But like Dagan says, and like Kat says, I don't think it's converting.
Well, I don't think it's a nothing burger, just to be clear. I think it's an I don't know burger. I think that I'm going to wait and see. The fact that there's been so much changing of the stories from day to day always makes me listen a little more closely. But I completely agree with Dagan, and I completely agree with you as well about how if you do say every single thing is a smoking gun, people are going to stop listening.
The only thing that I don't understand, my parents instilled in me a deep-seated fear of the Soviet Union based on the Cold War. And I read John le Carré books, and I read the recent Kim Philby book about Russian spies. So if someone calls me on the phone and says, hello, this is Natasha, and me and Boris want to come have a meeting with you, the answer is going to be no, even if my father isn't running for the president.
It might not be
That's
no,
what,
Dagan. Come on.
I saw enough Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoons growing up that I agree with Dagan. I would have probably had the same.
You know, must kill moose and
yeah.
not taking that meeting.
Yeah, absolutely.
But isn't it ironic, though, that here the whole Trump clan, they're not politicians. And the thing is, the standard is, well, a politician would have taken the meeting. They're not politicians. So maybe Donald Jr., nobody sat back and said to him, you know what? Don't even talk about this issue. Don't go there. Maybe they just really didn't know what was up on this thing. It doesn't excuse possibly a prosecutor looking at this. But right now, again, it's that expectation. There's something wrong here.
Well, here's the thing, though. If they would have thought there was nothing wrong with it, why wasn't he more forthcoming about it from the beginning rather than changing his story so many times?
Even if you consider information as an asset or something of value, it wasn't exchanged. She duped them, and so there was actual no transfer of value whatsoever. She was trying to get a meeting. This Russian lawyer was just trying to get a meeting with the Trump administration
it is easy.
about her issue.
It is easy a year after the fact to say that it was inappropriate, to say that maybe he should have thought this through. When you're in a campaign at any level, I can tell you this from experience. It's like being in a blender, and every once in a while they take the top off to see what flies out. They probably didn't even think about all of the blowback that they were going to get now that they are out here actively looking for a smoking gun, and they don't have one.
Someone hired Christopher Steele in England to do this opposition research, Russian dossier on Donald Trump. Yeah. Someone hired them to do that. Now, if you want to use that same inappropriateness, illegality, whatever you want to call it, if you apply that, you should find out who that person or people were and find out who did that, because that could be just as damning as anything Donald Jr. did with the Russians.
There's a great article by Paul Roderick Gregory writing for the Hoover Institution about this very subject, and it's about that Russia didn't interfere in the U.S. election to help President Trump, but to destabilize America. And that's what it's essentially doing, because this is where one of the greatest divides, certainly among people on the right and the left, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, is being angry over this issue.
There is a group called Fusion GPS. Now, that group is they're involved with setting up the meeting by the Russian lawyer with Donald Trump Jr. The same group and the same guy, Simpson. He's one of the founders of Fusion GPS. He was involved in the Russian dossier that hurt Donald Trump and was allegedly going to help Hillary Clinton. So it's very quirky, and that may lend credibility to, hey, they were just interested in destabilizing, not picking a winner.
Really quickly, I know journalists who worked, well-known journalists in the 80s, and they would get calls from people saying they're with Russian news agencies, and these guys would show up, and they were clearly KGB, and it was comical, but everybody knew it. And I just think that we kind of lost that connection with Russia as our enemy and what we went through during the Cold War. And I think it's a little lost on some of the people involved in this.
Well, coming up, a former Gitmo detainee who killed a U.S. soldier now officially made a millionaire by Canada. And the soldier's widow may never see a single penny. Stay with us.
The Canadian ex-Gitmo detainee who admitted to killing U.S. Army Sergeant Christopher Speer during a 2002 firefight in Afghanistan is now a multimillionaire. Cotter scored a reported $8 million payout from the Canadian government, alleging civil rights violations during his time in Gitmo. But Cotter's actual victims may end up going penniless from his actions. Tabitha Speer, Sergeant Speer's widow, and Lane Morris, a retired Special Forces sergeant who was blinded in the firefight, won a $134 million judgment, wrongful death judgment, in fact, against Cotter 2 years ago in Utah. Their lawyers requested an order freezing Cotter's now multi-million-dollar assets, but a Canadian judge has thrown out that request, calling it extraordinary. How is this justice, Eric? I mean, this story is... repulsive.
So you have to look at, I'm trying to figure, maybe Herman Cain can clue us in on some of this. How does Justin Trudeau allow this to go down? I mean, does he just look the other way and say, he was quote unquote tortured at Gitmo, so he deserved? I think Cotter sued the Canadian government for $16 million, and they settled for only $8 million. It's insanity.
Explanation was because he's a Canadian citizen. There is a quirk in the law that said that Canada didn't step up to defend him, whatever that meant. It is a pathetic interpretation of the law. Canada basically rewarded a murderer. And how you are able to justify that is beyond me.
The actions, Michael, of the Prime Minister, of Trudeau, are actually worse than that, because there was a Canadian press wire service that said Trudeau knew there was an outstanding judgment against Cotter in Utah, and that the Canadian wire service reported that Ottawa rushed the payment to Cotter to dodge compliance with the Utah judgment for the Speer family and for Mr. Morris. They filed that injunction to enforce the Utah judgment in Canada, and the Trudeau government had the money out the door before their petition could be heard in court. This is according to an editorial in the Journal today.
My thought is, what would we do if the situation was reversed? If we had somebody in our grasp who had killed a Canadian, would we be saying, no, of course we're going to give you money. Of course we're going to take care of your rights. No, we wouldn't. You know, they were enemy combatants. Right. He actually participated in a military operation against U.S. soldiers. At the very least, Canada should sit there and say, you know what, we're in solidarity with you. We're not going to protect this guy against a murderous act like that.
Okay. Is this a situation where they didn't have a choice? I mean, I don't think anyone would want to do this. This is obviously a disgusting story. I think everyone can agree that you see this happen, you look at this, and you don't feel good. And you see him also in interviews complaining, how am I going to have a life now? Because everyone knows I killed somebody and I want to be a nurse. Well, I don't feel bad for you at all, believe me. But what do you do? Is there, I don't know if anybody can answer that question for me. Was there any other option under the law, or why?
That judge had the choice. Remember, that's what opened up the floodgates. That judge could have said, because of the extenuating circumstances, because he killed someone, because there's an outstanding judgment, that judge could have exercised some discretion, and he did not. That was the option. He could
have also said, yes, we're awarding you $8 million, but we're going to go ahead and pay it to the,
right.
to the family of the victim in Utah.
But they took it a step further and actually made this payment, timed it so it would make it impossible for the Spears family and for Lane Morris to collect this. I just really wanted this is the Peter Kent editorial I was referring to in the Wall Street Journal. He writes, Peter Kent is a member of Canadian Parliament, official opposition critic for foreign affairs. He writes, Mr. Trudeau's actions are an affront to the memory of Christopher Speer, to Tabitha Speer and her children, to Lane Morris, to our U.S. allies, and to all men and women in uniform. Mm-hmm. This payout was a cynical subversion of Canadian principles. Mr. Trudeau made Omar Khadr a millionaire, and he did not have to.
I think Michael made a great point. If it were the other way around, the United States would have found a way to honor their laws. They simply disregarded our laws. And that's why, to answer your question, it was not just.
And remember, we were supposed to be a coalition fighting terror at the time.
Yes.
Right? And now.
Yeah.
Thanks, Canada.
But again, the rights over a terrorist, the rights over those he harmed. When we come back, time to wake up, America. Jane Sanders now claiming sexism is behind a federal probe into her and her husband, Bernie. Eric Bolling begs to differ.